everybody! Today, Honey is going to continue reading Wayside School Gets a Little Stranger, written by Louis Shacker and illustrated by Tim Helch. Chapter 7, A Bad Word. Early in the morning, a white limousine drove up to Wayside School, just like always. A shuffler got out of the car, then opened the passenger door. Just like always. Mr. Kitchwater stepped out of the car. "Thank you, James," he said. "My name is David," said the shuffler. Just like always. Mr. Kitchwater entered the school building. "Good morning, Mr. Kitchwater," said Mrs. Day, the school secretary. She handed him a cup of hot coffee. Just like always. "Thank you, Miss Knight," said Mr. Kitchwater. He walked into his office, except his office door was closed. He smashed into it, spilling coffee all over his green suit. "Who closed my door?" he demanded. "Why didn't you just open it?" asked Mrs. Day. "It's always open this morning," said Mr. Kitchwater. "How was I supposed to know it was closed this time?" Up on the 30th story, Mrs. Jules took roll. Todd was absent. "Oh dear, I hope Todd is all right," said Mrs. Jules. "Todd's never all right," said Joy. She and Mauricia laughed. Damien looked at Mrs. Jules. Ever since he returned to Wayside School, he thought there was something different about her, but he still couldn't figure out what it was. Mr. Kitchwater's voice came over the PA system. "Good morning, boys and girls." There was the usual pause. "Today I want to talk about doors," said Mr. Kitchwater. "This should be interesting," said Mrs. Jules. "Do you know how many doors are in this school building?" asked Mr. Kitchwater. Mrs. Jules shook her head. "Well, there are a lot, over 30. And some of you probably have doors at home too. Maybe more than one. All those doors. Think about it." "Well, Mr. Kitchwater has certainly given us something to think about this morning," said Mrs. Jules. "So remember," said Mr. Kitchwater, "and please be careful. Always check to see if a door is open before going through it. And if it's not open, open it. If you can't open it yourself, ask someone to open it for you. This may not make a lot of sense to you now, but someday you'll thank me." Mrs. Jules looked around the class. "That's good advice," she said. "I think most of you probably knew it, but at least it's nice to know we have a principal who cares." "I hate doors," shouted Mr. Kitchwater. "It's a dumb word. Door, door, door. Who made up that word anyway?" Mrs. Jules waited a little longer, but Mr. Kitchwater seems to be finished. "Some people just don't like doors," she said. "I have made a new rule," declared Mr. Kitchwater. "You may no longer say that word. You know what word I mean, but don't say it. Instead, I have made up a new word for you. Guzak. Open the Guzak. Shut the Guzak. Lock the Guzak. Don't you think it's a better word? I do. From now on, the other word is a bad word. I have made my decision." Everyone turned around and looked at the Guzak. Suddenly it opened. Todd entered. "Sorry I'm late," he said. "That's okay," said Mrs. Jules. "I'm just glad you're not sick or hurt." "My dad locked the keys in his car," Todd explained. "We had to use a coat hanger to unlock the door." Everyone gasped. Mrs. Jules made Todd write his name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Chapter 8, Santa Claus. 'Twas the last day of school before winter vacation, and the children were having a small celebration. Their artwork was hung by the blackbirds and pride. Snowmen, mooses, and a joyful sleigh ride. They ate homemade cookies, Red and green ones, of course. Even when Kathy declared, "I don't believe in Santa Claus," she just opened her mouth and said what she said. Santa Claus isn't real, and besides that, he's dead. So you bet I will pout, and you will bet I will cry. You bet I will shout, I'm telling you why. Stephen covered his ears. "No, you're wrong," he shouted. "It's not true. There is a Santa Claus. I know there is." "Ho, ho, ho," laughed Kathy. "Kathy is just saying that because she never gets any presents," said Jason. "All she ever gets is a lump of coal," said Randy. "Wrong," said Kathy. "I got lots of presents. My parents buy them for me. They have lots of money. They buy me anything I want." She bit off the head of a reindeer cookie. "The only thing that matters is how rich your parents are. If you have lots of money, then you'll get lots of good presents. If you're poor, then you'll just get a few crummy presents." Everyone tried to argue with her, but Kathy just asked them all the old questions like, "How does a fat man fit down the skinny chimney?" Or, "How could he visit everyone's house in the whole world in one night?" And of course, nobody knew the answers. Nobody ever has. "Only Santa knows the answers to those questions," said Ronnie. "Don't you even like Christmas?" asked Stephen. "Sure," said Kathy. "I get lots of presents and I don't have to work." Then she stuck out her tongue and called Stephen a jerk. Poor Stephen sputtered as his face turned quite blue. "If you don't believe in Santa, he won't believe in you." But Kathy just yelped, "You know what? That's true. Do you still believe in the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, and Miss Nerves too?" "Let's ask Mrs. Jules," said Marcia. "She's a teacher who's wise." "Let's ask Mrs. Jules. She never lies." The children crowded around their wise teacher's desk and asked her the question never found on a test. "Is there a Santa?" You're the teacher with smirch. "Is Santa real?" they asked with pure hearts. And oh, Mrs. Jules, the teacher so wise, looked at their faces and bright eager eyes. She had to say something. It was her job to reply. "Tell them," yelped Kathy, "the reindeer can't fly." Outside the window, snowflakes were falling. Inside the window, Mrs. Jules was stalling. "Are our parents all liars? Is it all just a trick to make us be good for fear of Saint Nick? Tell us the truth. Don't try to fake it. Is there a Santa? Let us know. We can take it." Mrs. Jules cleared her throat. Then she cleared it again. She put down her pencil and picked up her pen. "Hey, look!" shouted loudly. "Look there! Who's that? Someone is coming in through the goose egg." Sure enough, the door opened. It had to open quite wide, as a strange-looking stranger stepped sideways inside. He wore a red suit and had a white floppy beard, and even for Wayside, he looked pretty weird. His fat belly shook like a bowl full of jello. There was no doubt about it. They knew that fellow. It was Louis, the yard teacher. "What are you doing in the stupid suit, Louis?" asked Shirley. Aren't you hot?" "Why are you wearing a fake beard?" asked Todd. "Is that a pillow under your jacket?" asked Jason. Kathy was delighted. "See," she said, "that proves there is no Santa Claus. If there was, Louis wouldn't have to dress up like a fool and pretend to be him." "I'm not Louis," said Louis. "I'm Santa Claus. Ho, ho." "You're lying to us, Louis," said John. "Everyone is always lying to us. Kathy's right. Christmas is nothing but a dirty, stinking lie." I was just trying to bring a little holiday cheer," said Louis. "Go home, Germo," said Terrace. "Now, that's no way to talk to Louis," said Mrs. Jules. "Louis is one of Santa's special helpers." "Really, Louis?" asked Dee. Louis looked at Mrs. Jules. "That's right," he said. The children were all very impressed. Have you ever met him? Demanded Kathy. Well, no, not exactly, Louis admitted. See, said Kathy, it's just another lie. You don't have to meet Santa to be one of his special helpers, said Mrs. Jules. Then how do you know what he wants you to do? Asked John. That's easy, said Mrs. Jules. You just have to be nice to other people. Whenever you give someone a present or sing a holiday song, you're helping Santa Claus. To me, that's what Christmas is all about, helping Santa Claus. Can I be one of his helpers? Asked Damien. You bet, said Mrs. Jules. Hey everybody, shouted Damien. I'm one of Santa's helpers. Me too, said Allison. There must be a Santa Claus, cheered Stephen, because it feels so good to help him. So the children all helped Santa in every way they could, by singing songs and giving gifts and just by being good. But there is no Santa Claus, Kathy continued to yelp. Well, if that's the case, said Mrs. Jules, he must really need our help. Chapter 9. Something different about Mrs. Jules. The children returned from Christmas vacation. On each desk were 2 knitting needles and a hunk of yarn. Today, we are going to learn how to knit, said Mrs. Jules. She showed the class how it was done. See, you stick this needle through here, then wrap this around this like this, stick this through this, pull this like this, and then you stick this here. Any questions? Everyone stared at her. Good, said Mrs. Jules. I want everybody to make socks. Okay, get started. Damien looked at his knitting needles. He didn't have a clue. He looked back at Mrs. Jules. Now, more than ever, he was sure she was somehow different. She was sitting at a desk, knitting and eating ballonios. Damien couldn't remember Mrs. Jules ever eating a ballonio before. A ballonio was an oral cookie, except instead of the white part, there was a round hunk of bologna. Miss Mush invented them. Hey, Mac, whispered Damien. Does Mrs. Jules seem different to you? She's fat, said Mac. That's not a nice thing to say, said Damien. Didn't you say I didn't say it to Mrs. Jules, said Mac. I didn't go, hey, Mrs. Jules, you're fat. Mrs. Jules cleared her throat as she stood up. She walked around the room. Very nice, DJ, she said. You're doing fine, Rondi. She stopped at Joe's desk. Oh, Joe, she gushed. Look, everybody, I want you to see Joe's sock. She held it up. Isn't it the most beautiful sock you ever saw? It was a great sock. Everybody oohed and awed. Joe was as surprised as anyone. He didn't know he could how to make socks, but the boy was born to knit. Mrs. Jules started to cry. I love this sock, she sobbed. Uh-oh, said Kathy. I think she's finally flipped out. I love you, Kathy, said Mrs. Jules. She looked around the room. I love all of you. She put her hand on Kathy's desk. I love this desk, she said. I love the blackbird. I love the clock on the wall. There was a ruler on the floor. Mrs. Jules picked it up. I love this ruler, she declared. Hey, that's mine, said Dana. But, that's okay, Mrs. Jules. You can have it. I don't want your ruler, Dana, said Mrs. Jules, handing it to her. You want my pair of scissors? Offered Sherry. Don't give her anything sharp, warned Kathy. Mrs. Jules wiped away her tears and smiled at the class. I'm going to miss all of you very much, she said. Are you going away? Said Damien. Yeah, to the loony bin, whispered Kathy. Are you sick? Asked Eric Evans. No, I'm not sick, said Mrs. Jules. In fact, I'm better than I've ever been, she beamed. I'm going to have a baby. Everyone gasped. Damien couldn't believe it. He was so happy he jumped out of his seat and hugged Mrs. Jules. She was soon surrounded by her old students, even Kathy, wanting to hug her. Today is my last day here, Mrs. Jules told her students. My doctor doesn't want me walking up down 30 flights of stairs every day. I wasn't even supposed to come here today, but I just had to say goodbye. I thought you were getting fat, said Mac, but I didn't want to say anything. Thank you, Mac, said Mrs. Jules. You're very considerate. Can I touch your stomach? Asked Stephen. Mrs. Jules laughed. Sure, she said. The children took turns touching her stomach. What are you going to name your baby? Asked Allison. I don't know yet, said Mrs. Jules. What do you think? Well, if she's a girl, said Allison, I think you should name her Rainbow Sunshine. That's a nice name, said Mrs. Jules. And if he's a boy? Buckethead, said Allison. She didn't like boys. If he's a boy, you should name him Jet Rocket, said Joel. Jet Rocket Jules, mused Mrs. Jules. That has a nice ring to it. And what if she's a girl? Cootie face, said Joe. Mrs. Jules laughed. So let me get this straight, she said. If he's a boy, I'll name him Buckethead. Right, said Allison and Rondi. And if she's a girl, I'll name him Cootie face. Right, said Joe and John. Damien laughed. He knew Mrs. Jules was only joking. At least he hoped she was. Terence placed its palm flat against Mrs. Jules's stomach. Hey! He exclaimed. The dude kicked me. Suddenly, Damien felt very sad. He was going to miss her a lot. He wiped a tear from his eye. It's unfair, he shouted. We finally come back to Wayside School after being gone for so long. And now you're leaving us. I have to, said Mrs. Jules. I know, whined Damien. You have to make sure that you and your baby are healthy, but it still isn't fair. I think you'll like your substitute teacher, said Mrs. Jules. I spoke him over the vacation. He seems like a very nice man. A man? Asked Damien. Cool. They all thought it was pretty neat to have a man teacher. Yes, said Mrs. Jules. His name is Mr. Garf.